welcome to our deep dive into the Vietnam War.
Ooh, a big one.
Yeah, buckle up. This is going to be a long one.
Yeah, we're going to be dissecting excerpts from the Wikipedia article on the war.
Ah, good old Wikipedia.
To try to get some fascinating insights into this complex conflict.
Yeah, Wikipedia is a good place to start. Gives us a broad overview before we can zero in on all the fascinating details.
And I think the different names used for the war are a great place to start.
Okay.
You got the Vietnam War, Second Indochina War.
Right.
Even just Nam. But then there's how the Vietnamese refer to it, Kháng Chiến Chống Mo, meaning resistance war against America.
Yeah.
That really highlights the different lenses people use to view this conflict.
It does. Yeah, like two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
U.S. saw it through the Cold War, aiming to contain communism.
Right.
But for the Vietnamese, it was about fighting for independence and unification against foreign powers.
Yeah.
And that struggle for independence has roots in the First Indochina War, which we can't overlook.
Right.
This is where the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, fought against French colonial rule. It eventually led to Vietnam's independence, but also set the stage for the later conflict, right?
Exactly. And it's important to note that even back then, the U.S. was already getting involved.
Oh, wow.
Driven by the Cold War and the Truman Doctrine.
Right.
This doctrine basically framed U.S. foreign policy around containing communism.
Okay.
So even in those early years, the seeds of greater involvement were being sown.
So how did the First Indochina War actually end? Was it a clear victory for either side?
Well, it culminated in a pivotal moment, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954.
Okay.
This wasn't just a defeat for the French.
Right.
It signaled the end of Western colonial dominance in the region.
Wow.
And it's even more intriguing when you consider that the U.S. contemplated using nuclear weapons to support the French.
Ultimately deciding against it.
Can you imagine the ramifications if they had?
Yeah, that's a
chilling thought.
Whole other deep dive right there.
It is, yeah.
Alternate history.
But instead, the battle led to the Geneva Conference and the division of Vietnam, right? So in 1954, Vietnam was divided along the 17th parallel with Ho Chi Minh's communist forces in the north and the U.S.-backed Ngo Diem leading the south.
That's right.
The plan was to hold elections in 1956 to reunify the country. But, as you can probably guess, those elections never happened.
Never happened.
So what went wrong? Why weren't those elections held?
Well, the U.S. was deeply concerned about a communist victory.
Makes sense.
The Cold War was at its peak. And they feared a domino effect with one country after another falling to communism in Southeast Asia.
Okay, that makes sense given the political climate at the time.
Sure.
So with the country divided?
How did things play out in South Vietnam under Diem?
Well, Diem's rule was controversial. He faced opposition from various groups and was accused of authoritarianism and corruption, leading to significant instability and a series of coups.
Wow.
In 1963, Diem himself was assassinated, deepening the political turmoil in South Vietnam.
That political instability must have created a dangerous vacuum.
Yeah. It's a recipe for disaster, for sure.
And it seems that's when we see the situation escalate dramatically with the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964.
Right, the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
Huge turning point.
Big turning point, yeah.
Yeah.
It involved alleged attacks on U.S. Navy ships by North Vietnamese forces. Now we know from declassified information that the circumstances were murky. And that the second attack might not have even happened.
Wait, so the U.S. escalated its involvement based on an incident that might not have even occurred?
Well, despite the questionable evidence, the incident led to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which granted President Johnson broad authority to escalate U.S. military action in Vietnam.
And that's how we see the rapid increase in U.S. troop deployments, the launch of Operation Rolling Thunder, right?
Exactly.
That massive bombing campaign aimed at North Vietnam.
Aimed at cutting off supplies, trying to disrupt the North Vietnamese war effort.
So the U.S. was conducting bombing campaigns in both Vietnam and Laos. Just how extensive were these bombings?
Oh, incredibly extensive.
Yeah.
Laos was hit with more bombs per capita than any other country in history.
Oh, my God.
The human and environmental costs were devastating.
It's difficult to comprehend the sheer destruction those bombings caused.
Yeah.
But even with that level of firepower, the U.S. was facing a formidable opponent in the North Vietnamese.
Oh, yeah.
And Viet Cong forces, weren't they?
They were. They used guerrilla tactics effectively, making it extremely difficult for the U.S. to achieve a decisive victory.
And then, in 1968, came the Tet Offensive, which I understand was a major turning point in public opinion about the war back in the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely.
What made it such a psychological victory? Was it just the element of surprise?
It was the element of surprise. It was the scale of the attacks.
Right.
It demonstrated the strength and resilience of the communist forces despite the heavy bombing and U.S. military presence.
Right.
The fighting, particularly the devastating Battle of Hue, was widely reported.
Okay.
And it shattered the American public's belief in a swift victory.
Right.
It became clear that this war would be longer and more costly than initially anticipated.
So, faced with mounting casualties and shifting public opinion, how did the U.S. government adapt its strategy?
Well, President Nixon came into office in 1969 with a new approach. Vietnamization. This policy aimed to gradually withdraw U.S. troops while simultaneously building up the South Vietnamese army to take over the fighting.
This Vietnamization policy seems like a complex undertaking. Was it successful?
It had mixed results.
Okay.
While U.S. troop withdrawals did begin, the war dragged on, and the South Vietnamese armies struggled to hold their ground. The conflict was far from over.
And what about the involvement of other countries in the war? We know the U.S. was supporting South Vietnam, but who was backing the North?
Well, China and the Soviet Union played crucial roles in supporting North Vietnam. They provided extensive military equipment, financial aid, and even personnel, allowing North Vietnam to sustain its war effort.
It's fascinating to see how the Vietnam War became a proxy conflict. In the larger Cold War between the superpowers?
Absolutely.
Were there any other significant players in this complex web of alliances and rivalries?
Well, the sources also mention an organization called FULRO, which stands for the United Front for the Liberation of Oppressed Races. They represented various ethnic minority groups in South Vietnam fighting for autonomy or independence. This adds another layer of complexity to an already multifaceted conflict.
It seems like there were so many different factions and interests at play in the Vietnam War.
Absolutely.
And sadly, as we know, no war is without its dark side.
Yeah, for sure.
The sources mention war crimes being committed on both sides.
Sadly, that's true. Both sides committed atrocities during the war. The My Lai massacre, where U.S. troops killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, is a stark reminder of the horrors of war. And the Hue massacre, where Viet Cong forces killed thousands of civilians, stands as another grim testament to the brutality of this conflict.
It's a sobering reminder that war always comes with a human cost.
Absolutely.
These atrocities underscore the need for accountability and a commitment to preventing such tragedies in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's important to remember that the Vietnam War wasn't just about military strategies and political ideologies. It was about the lives of real people caught in the crossfire of a global conflict.
Absolutely. And the war's end was just the beginning of another chapter filled with challenges and complexities.
I'm ready to dive into that next chapter.
Let's do it.
We've covered a lot of ground so far.
We have.
But there's still much more to explore.
Absolutely.
So with the U.S. officially out of the war after the Paris Peace Accords in 1973. Did that mark the end of the fighting in Vietnam?
Not quite.
Or was there more to come?
Unfortunately, the Paris Peace Accords, they were meant to bring peace. But they proved to be quite fragile.
It seems like
fighting continued between North and South Vietnam.
A lot of wars end with these supposedly peaceful agreements. But the fighting just drags on.
It's like hitting pause, not stop.
Right.
And in 1975, the North Vietnamese launched a massive offensive. Quickly overwhelming the South Vietnamese forces. They captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, marking the fall of South Vietnam and the official end of the war.
So the fall of Saigon must have been a chaotic and heartbreaking event for those who had supported the South Vietnamese government.
Oh, absolutely.
What happened to them in the aftermath?
Well, the new communist government established re-education camps.
Re-education camps.
For former South Vietnamese officials, soldiers, and anyone deemed a threat to the regime.
These re-education camps sound pretty intense.
Yeah.
What was the stated purpose of these camps?
Well,
and what was life actually like for those sent there?
Officially, the government claimed that these camps were for re-education and reintegration into society.
Okay.
But the reality was often much harsher.
Right.
Detainees faced political indoctrination, forced labor, and in some cases, torture and imprisonment.
Wow.
Without trial.
It sounds like a very difficult...
Yeah, a very dark chapter.
Yeah, an uncertain time for many South Vietnamese.
Absolutely.
Beyond the political changes, were there lasting physical scars left by the war?
Oh, absolutely.
I remember the sources mentioned something about unexploded ordnance.
Yeah, that's one of the tragic legacies of the Vietnam War that continues to impact the region today.
Wow.
Millions of unexploded bombs, landmines, and other ordnance remain scattered across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia.
That sounds incredibly dangerous.
It is, yeah.
How does this unexploded ordnance affect people's lives decades after the war?
It's a constant threat.
Yeah.
Even today, people are still being killed or injured by these hidden explosives.
Wow.
They make farming dangerous.
Right.
They hinder development and pose a constant risk to communities.
It's a sobering reminder of the long-lasting consequences of war, even long after the fighting has stopped. And then there's the refugee crisis that followed the war.
Huge humanitarian crisis.
Yeah. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So the fall of South Vietnam led to a mass exodus of people fleeing the country, fearing persecution under the new communist regime.
It must have been a terrifying experience to flee your home country with just the hope of a better life somewhere else.
Absolutely.
Where did these refugees go?
Many fled by boat,
risking
dangerous journeys across the South China Sea.
Wow.
They became known as the boat people.
The boat people?
Countries like the U.S., Canada, Australia, and France resettled many of these refugees. But it was a challenging and often traumatic experience for those seeking asylum.
Imagine leaving everything, behind and starting over in a new country with a different language and culture.
I can't even imagine.
The resilience of those refugees is truly remarkable.
It is, yeah.
And speaking of the U.S., the war had a profound impact on American society as well, didn't it?
It did.
Yeah.
The Vietnam War was a turning point in American history. It fueled anti-war sentiment, divided the nation, and led to a reevaluation of U.S. foreign policy and the role of military intervention abroad.
I've often heard the term Vietnam Syndrome used in discussions about U.S. foreign policy. Can you explain what that means?
Basically, Vietnam Syndrome refers to the reluctance of the American public and policymakers to engage in foreign military interventions after the Vietnam War. It reflects the trauma and disillusionment felt by many Americans due to the war's high cost in terms of lives and resources.
It's interesting to see how a single conflict can have such a lasting impact on a nation's psyche and its approach to foreign policy.
Absolutely.
But the war's impact extended beyond politics, didn't it? It also had a profound effect on American culture.
For sure. I mean, the Vietnam War has been a recurring theme in American literature, film, and music.
Right, from movies like Apocalypse Now, Platoon, and Full Metal Jacket to iconic protest songs of the era.
Exactly.
The war has had a lasting influence on artistic expression and cultural discourse.
For sure. It's seeped into the fabric of American culture.
It's a testament to the war's enduring legacy, that it continues to inspire and provoke reflection on the complexities of war, the human cost of conflict, and the search for peace and understanding.
Yeah, I think it's a conflict that we'll continue to grapple with for generations to come.
We've covered a lot of ground today, but there are always more stories to uncover and perspectives to consider.
Absolutely.
We've explored the major turning points and the lasting consequences of the Vietnam War. But I'm curious about some of the more specific details that might not make it into the history books. What are some of the lesser known but equally fascinating aspects of this conflict?
Yeah, that's what I love about these deep dives, is that you find those little hidden gems of history. And one thing that comes to mind is the types of weapons that were used in the Vietnam War were quite diverse, even extending beyond conventional firearms and bombs.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What kind of unconventional weaponry are we talking about?
Well, one that comes to mind is Agent Orange.
Agent Orange, right?
A defoliant used to clear dense jungle vegetation.
Okay.
The aim was to expose enemy positions and disrupt supply routes.
Right.
Unfortunately, Agent Orange had devastating long-term health effects on both Vietnamese civilians and U.S. veterans.
It's a tragic reminder that the impact of war often extends far beyond the immediate battlefield.
Absolutely.
Affecting generations to come. What other unconventional weapons were used?
Well, another one that was widely used and remains highly controversial to this day is napalm.
I've heard of napalm, but I don't fully understand how it works. Can you explain it?
Yeah, so napalm is a gel-like substance that's incredibly flammable.
Okay.
It sticks to surfaces and burns at extremely high temperatures.
Okay.
It was used in incendiary bombs, often causing horrific burns and civilian casualties.
It's difficult to imagine the suffering caused by such a weapon. Switching gears a bit. The sources mention the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It sounds like it was a critical lifeline.
Oh, yeah.
For the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, it wasn't just a single road.
Okay.
It was this complex network of roads, paths, and even tunnels that ran through the dense jungles and mountainous terrain of Laos and Cambodia. It was a logistical marvel, allowing North Vietnam to supply its troops and the Viet Cong in the south, despite constant U.S. bombing efforts.
It sounds incredibly challenging to build and maintain such a network under those conditions. How did they manage to keep it operational?
Well, the North Vietnamese were incredibly resourceful and determined.
Yeah.
They constantly repaired and adapted the trail to evade bombing attacks. They even used bicycles and elephants to transport supplies.
Bicycles and elephants, that paints a vivid picture of the logistical challenges they faced.
Yeah, they were.
It's clear that this war demanded incredible adaptability and innovation from both sides. We've discussed the political and strategic aspects of a war, but I think it's crucial to remember the human cost.
For sure.
Can you help us grasp the scale of the casualties?
It's estimated that millions of Vietnamese civilians and soldiers died during the war.
Wow.
And it's important to remember that each number represents a human life, a story cut short, a family forever changed.
Millions of lives lost. It's a staggering and heartbreaking figure. Beyond the raw numbers, how did the war impact the lives of everyday Vietnamese people?
I mean, the war tore families apart, destroyed homes and livelihoods, and left lasting psychological scars.
Right.
Millions were displaced, becoming refugees in their own country or fleeing abroad.
Right.
The physical and emotional wounds of the war continued to affect Vietnamese society long after the fighting ceased.
It's a reminder that the true cost of war cannot be measured solely in casualties. It's about the shattered lives, the lost potential, and the enduring trauma inflicted on individuals and communities.
Absolutely.
Looking back at the Vietnam War, what key lessons can we learn from this complex and tragic conflict?
Well, I think the Vietnam War offers many lessons, reminding us of the limits of military power, the importance of understanding different cultures and perspectives, and the need for clear communication and strategic planning in foreign policy.
Right.
It also highlights the vital role of diplomacy and peaceful conflict resolution in preventing future tragedies.
As we conclude our deep dive into the Vietnam War, I'm struck by the enduring impact this conflict has had on the world. It serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of war.
Absolutely.
And the importance of seeking peaceful solutions to international disputes.
Yeah, we have to learn from the past
to
build a better future.
It's crucial to remember the individuals whose lives were forever altered by this war. Their stories should inspire us to work towards a future where conflicts are resolved through dialogue, empathy, and a shared commitment to peace. Thank you for joining us on this journey of exploration.
It's been my pleasure.
We encourage you to continue learning about the Vietnam War, seeking out diverse perspectives, and engaging in thoughtful conversations about its legacy and its enduring relevance in today's world.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep diving deep